What's going on, everyone? My name is Tezu, and today we're going to be taking a look at some of the news to come out from the Hytale team this week. For those of you who missed it, this week we received a blog post going over some of the wildlife that we can expect to encounter during our time in Zone 1. Of course, you can find all of this information over on Hytale's blog, which I'll leave a link to down in the description. But for this week's video, we'll be going over that blog post discussing all of the new wildlife we've been introduced to this week. The blog post this week opens up by reminding us about the World Gin introduction post they made back in January. This blog post had originally introduced us to the world of Orbis and explained how the world was divided into different zones. Each of these zones looks to be a large sweeping area that is completely unique from the last. For example, Zone 1 appears to be a very lush area. With green forests and large open plains, it's much like you'd expect any starter area in any other game to be like. In contrast, Zone 4 is a barren wasteland covered in magma and ash, with an unusual dinosaur biome buried deep underground. But for today's video, obviously we'll only be focusing on the first biome. That means that all the creatures we're talking about in today's video can be found as soon as you start the game. These are the creatures that you can typically expect to find in the forests, open plains, riverlands, and some caves. Starting off, the first thing we're introduced to this week is the grizzly bear. The grizzly bears are tall creatures, looking almost to be as big as players themselves. But what's most interesting about them is that much like their real-life counterparts, apparently they're incredibly territorial. This means that they won't attack the player immediately, however, if you provoke them or refuse to get out of their way, you could be in for a pretty rough day. However, if you do find yourself on the wrong side of one of these guys, apparently they won't chase you beyond the boundaries of their territory, meaning if you're quick enough, you might just get away. Alternatively, if you can manage to damage them enough, they'll also try and retreat to hibernate and restore their health a little bit. This means if you poked a bear and gotten yourself into trouble, if you poke it just a little bit harder, you might be able to get yourself out of that trouble. Now, personally, I'm hoping these guys are a lot like the bears in Skyrim, serving as incredibly powerful creatures in the early game that new players want to avoid. This would serve as a pretty neat barrier system to stop the player from just walking over everything in Zone 1 pretty early on in the game. Either way, I think the bear is going to make a really cool addition to the game. Moving on though, we're next introduced to some of the ambient wildlife that we'll be able to encounter in the forests of Zone 1. This includes both the frogs and the ducks, both of whom have some very interesting facial expressions going on. The frogs, while they look adorable hopping along, look rather agitated with the whole world. In contrast though, the ducks look really distressed in their new watery home. The blog does go on to note that these creatures pose no threat to the player, but rather they're just there to make the ecology livelier and more diverse throughout the different zones. This tells us that we can expect other ambient wildlife to appear in the later zones as well. Additionally, we're also able to meet the sparrow this week. Much like the frogs and the ducks, the sparrow is another example of ambient life. However, they also have a pretty interesting interaction with the trocs. Apparently, trocs are quite easily distracted by a nearby sparrow, sometimes even trying to attack them by hurling their spears up at them. The trocs, of course, are one of the many factions of Orbis. They look like large goblins and live in a hierarchical-looking society. The different animations and interactions that the frogs, sparrows, and ducks bring to us is really exciting. It highlights a bunch of tiny little details that other developers often forego in their games. So it's really cool seeing a game come up with all these tiny little details in their world. Moving on, we're introduced to a few new creatures: the deer, rats, bats, and the pigeon. While we aren't told a whole lot about any of these creatures, we can infer just a little bit from each of their pictures. The first thing to note is that the deers almost appear to be moving in a herd together. Judging from the other creatures we've already seen, it isn't too far-fetched to think that this might be the case. This leaves me hopeful that they might even be skittish to the player, as opposed to some NPCs in other games that just don't care when the player's nearby. Moving on to the bats and rats, however, looking at the background, they appear to be in two different caves. However, I don't think this is the case. I think that they may be in the same cave, but at different depths. This could imply that we might be able to see different creatures depending on how deep we go within the caves. This makes the prospect of venturing deeper down into these caves that much more exciting. And finally, we had our last creature in this week's blog post. And of course, since Hytale is looking to be an RPG-esque game, no RPG would be complete without giant spiders. If you have a fear of spiders as is, don't worry, it gets worse, as the creatures appear to be able to climb up trees. This would go on to imply that they can hide in the trees, jumping down and attacking the player from above when they least expect it. I don't know about you guys, but I'll certainly be keeping my eyes up as I travel through the forest of Zone 1. Anyway guys, that's it for this week. Be sure to leave a comment down below telling me which creatures you're most excited for, as well as what creatures you expect we might see in addition to these, or what you think these creatures might do that I could have missed already. If you liked the video, consider subscribing and check back next time as we continue to go over all the new Hytale news as it comes out. Once again, my name is Tezu, and I'll see you all next time.